You're with Julian on the brown note in the heat, still sweltering. A review of Optical Delusion, the 10th album by the legendary UK electronic act of Paul and Phil Hartnell, brothers who formed Orbital in 1989 and named after the M25 ring road that goes around London, which had kind of the birthplace of rave culture, which was that there would be parties in fields and you would find out where they were on the M25 and pull off into some field, and then the police would end up coming in and brutally beating everyone up. They are one of the most important and influential electronic acts of all time for three main reasons. One is they were the band most synonymous with moving electronic music away from the anonymous 12-inch single played by DJs and into the album format. And many British acts of the time, all of them legendary, did the same thing around the same time, but I would say that Orbital were the most preeminent. So you've got Underworld, Chemical Brothers, Prodigy, Left Field, just an astonishing array of talent that all emerged in that ferment at the start of the 90s, which was the best period in British music since the late 60s. Look at the shoegaze, indie, Britpop, trip hop, everything that came out at that time. It's just nuts. But they were the ones that fomented it, particularly the Brown album and Snivelization, which I might do a Gone But Forgotten review of. Both 10 out of 10 albums. Just incredible records. They moved on through Insides and sort of petered out towards the start of the 2000s. The other of those three things that were really important, apart from moving dance music onto the album, where it's never looked back from, is the live show. In 1994 they headlined the Pyramid Stage. Well, headlined, I think they were the last act on the Pyramid Stage at the Glastonbury Festival, the rock stage, the main stage. Unheard of. And it was broadcast by the BBC. I watched it in my bedroom, and the next year I was in the crowd in front of the Pyramid Stage in 1995, where they played just before Pulp played their epochal show. What a night that was, unforgettable. They took electronic music to the rock stage at music festivals. They were incredibly well known for their live performances. Again, lots of the electronic acts followed. Prodigy, Chemical Brothers, all became massive festival headliners. The Underworld, a lot of them. But again, I would say that the most important and probably the first were Orbital. And the last thing is politics. They always welded this sort of post-Thatcher political, they're talking about climate change and stuff back in the 90s, and Thatcher's Britain and the NHS and this kind of stuff cropping up on their albums. Well, I've been to see them over the years many times, and I was starting to get bored of the live set they were doing, because it didn't really change from the 90s. A lot of the stuff was stagnant. And then I saw them a couple of years ago in Sydney, and I was appalled. They went from this incredibly sculpted techno, which admittedly I'd got bored of hearing the same live set from the 90s all the way through to the 2000s, but they'd gone full-blown EDM. I was like, this is terrible. So their new album, Optical Delusion, I held no hope for at all. Pre this, last year they released an album called 30 Something, which was a well-earned victory lap looking back at 30 years of the band. And it was like one disc was them actually doing studio versions of the live reworkings of their songs. And then there was a couple of discs of remixes. And I thought the magazine Pitchfork got a couple of things really right. One of them was that Orbital are a really horrible band to remix. No remixes have really ever stuck. I think one of the problems is you get immediately less interesting percussion patterns, and everything's simplified when someone does a remix. They can only they can do their music. And the other thing that Pitchfork said was like the disc of them doing their own music was so much better than the remixes. The remixes I could have thrown away, most of them. But the hour of their own big tunes being done in the same way that they played them live was really great. But I still didn't hold out much hope for this, their 10th studio album. And I have to say, I have been very nicely surprised by a number of elements. The opening ringer, featuring fittingly Medieval Babes, harks back to Ring a Ring of Roses, We All Fall Down, a medieval Black Death nursery rhyme. It is the most political album overall, I think. Certainly going back to Snivelisation, it is a very politicised album, and obviously that is a very post-COVID track. It's got some nice throwbacks to early 90s synth pads. It's not too EDM at all. It's nice, muscular, up-tempo, mid-tempo. A lot of this album is in that same ballpark. And another thing that's really good here is that they keep everything sort of between the 4 and 5 minute mark. Most of the tracks on here. There's only one track that's really that much longer. So it doesn't get really deep into anything, but it does stop it. It feels fairly urgent and fairly upright and fairly dynamic. It doesn't dawdle. It's like if you got a new Reichsop album, you'd expect the down tempo to make things a lot driftier. Here they keep it quite upright. Dina Apovic does the kind of sort of soaring Gregorian chant vocal hook that they were famous for on tracks like Belfast on Day One, featuring Dina Ipovic. I don't know who these collaborators are. They're on nearly every track. Day One itself suggests something post-COVID as well. It's sort of like the day that it broke sort of thing. Track 3, Are You Alive, featuring Penelope Isles, has a pleasingly subtle melody and a chorus that is analogous to the kind of thing that Reichsop do, but it's got much more interesting percussion. And I really don't want to get effed in a working day or a working week or something like that. Still hanging on to a politicised thread, but the background is much more detailed and it's got a nice breakdown. It goes on for longer than any other track. The wonky You Are Here frequency, it's got some wonky bass and acid in it. That's got the most interesting soundstage, Are You the Frequency, featuring Little Pest, who turns up a bit later. Track 5, The New Abnormal, is almost like a mission statement in that it seems to rework one of their most famous tracks, Impact the Earth is Burning, a live highlight, and from their second Immortal album, the Brown album, which seemed to point towards global catastrophe back in '93 from climate change. It's got some old school breakbeats. The mix on the album as well is interesting because it's very pop. It's very sort of centre mix and quite loud, but not abrasive. It's very easy to listen to and hear quite loudly without having to sort of slam you over the head. And then we have probably the 3 best tracks in a row. We have Home featuring Anna B. Savage, which seems to be about climate change again, has a much more dramatic percussion and vocal hook, and her vocals wind around the song all the way through. Some of the best programmers of drums out there, I think, the Hartnell brothers, and of synth pads and of synth bass lines. They really are peerless amongst electronic music producers, I think. And after that track, it could have petered out, but we get the Sleaford Mods being an absolutely perfect fit for Orbital. The UK punk act with their anti-Tory scree would have fit right on Snivelisation, that album. For me, their high point. And the soundstage is really, really good, and it's talking about people that don't look like fried animals, like referring to gammons, and swearing about the Tories is a perfect fit here, and it's almost like doubling down on the fact that this is a pretty heavy anti-Tory Britain pro-climate change activism album, mentioning refugees at the bottom of the English Channel and stuff like that. Very timely. And Requiem for the Pre-Apocalypse actually invokes Are We Here, one of their greatest tracks from Snivelisation. definitely got the drum and bass vibe going on, and it's sort of, and that's sort of like a run of 3 tracks in a row. Moon Princess that ends it has another really memorable vocal and percussive pattern. The singer there, I think, is Cope. I don't know who that is. So even though this could be considered a mid-album, given that they sort of wandered off the beaten track for years and sort of gave up for a while and then sort of tried a hand at coming back, like the people like the Prodigy have sort of come back with these really lackluster albums, I'm going to up the ante on the review slightly here, because one, it's exceeded my expectations without actually not being an EDM album. It's not made that a problem. It's also referenced the past well. The track length and tempo has been surprisingly short and up tempo, and it's a very considered curation of tracks. They fit together really well, and at any point it's sort of starting to to drop off, you get into something like the Sleaford mods, and it kind of lifts it up again. And I like the mix of old and new here. It made them sound like less like a legacy act and more like somebody with something to say now. So probably above the curve here. I'm going to give Orbital and Optical Delusion a 8.5 out of 10.